John Ashworth was a preacher and writer who lived in Rochdale in the 1800s. He opened a chapel for the destitute in Rochdale and was well known for writing a series of strange tales in which he recorded some of the events of his ministry and retold stories of the people he encountered whose lives had been touched by God. The John Ashworth Trail begins at Cutgate in Rochdale. John Ashworth is thought to have been born in one of the cottages on Edenfield Road, on the right as you come out of Meadow View in Cutgate. He was born on the 8th of July 1813 and was the second son and eighth child of woolen weavers John and Alice Ashworth. The Ashworths of Bagslate were apparently a known family of handloom weavers in the area. John and Alice Ashworth had 10 children altogether, 7 daughters and 3 sons. On the day he was born, an old woman took John Ashworth in her arms, kissed him and looked in his face and said, "I bless thee, thou art a fine lad, but thou art one too many," because he came from such a large and struggling family. John Ashworth was baptised at St Chad's Parish Church in Rochdale on the 4th of October 1813. He describes where he lived at Cutgate, saying, "In this village there was one public house and 2 grocers' shops. The cottage in which I resided was 2 doors from the grocer's shop. One room next to the shop was used as a warehouse, and behind this room was a small place called the parlour." John Ashworth helped in the warehouse when he was about 7 years old. The tale of The Lost Curl is about a foolish, proud and showy young woman named Nanny who lived with her aunt at one of the grocer's shops in Cutgate. 19 or 20-year-old Nanny was so concerned about her looks, John Ashworth remembered hearing her scream one day when she accidentally burned off a large lock of her hair with her curling tongs. Nanny married a blacksmith called Robert, but Robert became fond of drinking, and when his malt business failed, he fled to America. Nanny was sent to prison for stealing a shawl and a pair of boots, taken to Liverpool and found guilty and sentenced to be transported beyond the sea for 7 years. When she heard the verdict, she apparently shrieked and fainted, and the jailer went on to cut off her hair to comply with the rules of the prison. Afterwards, Nanny was greatly humbled. Meanwhile, Robert returned from America but was still fond of malt. He went raving mad with delirium tremens and died when he leapt into the deep cold waters of the Lum near the valley of Cheesden. Bull baiting was common in Rochdale when John Ashworth was a boy. A bull would be fastened to a stake or post by a chain or rope about 6 yards long and set upon by dogs for the amusement of a crowd of spectators. On the 8th of November 1820, when John Ashworth was 7 years old, disaster struck at a bull bait which was taking place in the bed of the River Roach in Rochdale town centre, when the gathered crowds pressed in and the battlement of the old bridge was thrown down. 11 people died and many people were wounded, apparently in a manner too shocking for description. The name of the area in which these cruel and degrading events took place in the town is still known as the Butts. Bull baiting also took place in the neighbourhood of Cutgate and Bagslate, where John Ashworth grew up. One of the ringleaders was a notable character called Nathaniel Kershaw. As a boy, there was no man John Ashworth feared so much as Nathaniel Kershaw, or Niff as he was known. He later described Niff, saying, "On all hands, Niff was considered one of the worst of men, and he tried in every possible way to make all men for miles around as bad as himself." Another character of notoriety at those times was Jane Clough, an apparently powerful, masculine woman who, like Niff, engaged in and delighted in the bull baits, cock battles, dog fights, trail hunts, drinking and gambling that took place in Cutgate and Bagslate. In The Troublesome Halfpenny, John Ashworth writes about a boy called Johnny, almost certainly himself, who went every evening to fetch milk from a farmhouse called The Green when he was about 7. The Green is a row of 4 houses on the left as you head west along Edenfield Road, just before the entrance to Pargate Chase. One day when an old lady named Matty was filling his pitcher with milk, little Johnny stole a halfpenny which was left on a stone table inside the porch. He took the coin home, but was so deeply grieved at having done so that he trembled from head to foot and could not rest all night. The next day he returned the coin and asked old Matty to forgive him, which she did, saying he was a good boy for doing so. Mr. Ashworth said, "I began to be happy again. God seemed to smile down upon me," and concluded, "Many times since that day have I thanked the Lord for the tender conscience I then had, for that was my first and last theft, and the Lord still smiles upon me." As a boy, John Ashworth's companions said he was full of fun, frolicsome but thoughtful. One of his early companions was a boy called Thomas Platt. Thomas was one of 3 brothers, each of whom was born blind. Mr. Ashworth described Thomas as a strong, cheerful, healthy lad. He said, though he could not join us at marbles, spinning the top or catching the ball, or other boyish plays, he delighted to be amongst us, to share in our noise and mingle in our sports. He dearly loved a walk into the fields and was thankful to lean on the arm of any of his playfellows who would lead him. John Ashworth said he and Thomas went into Healy Wood to gather nuts one day, Thomas with his hand on John's shoulder to guide the way. John Ashworth described walking by his mother's side to the milkstone to collect milk when he was a boy. The milkstone was a large stone table supported by 3 thick stone pillars where country farmers brought their milk and were met by their town customers with pictures. It was on a hot summer day when he was walking by his poor mother's side as she toiled up the hill to reach the milkstone that John Ashworth said the painful fact that he was the poor child of poor parents flashed into his mind. His love for his mother was deep and lasting, and when he recognised she was so humble, toiling and kind, it prompted him to write a narrative about her. There is a street named Milkstone Place at the end of Milkstone Road off Drake Street in Rochdale, where the milkstone once stood. In the middle of Norden, near Cuckgate, there is a row of 4 houses on the corner of Trinity Street and Edenfield Road, where there was once a chapel called Bagslate Chapel. Bagslate Chapel was built in 1810. Mr. Ashworth said the school and place of worship at Bagslate Chapel was built by several who had received the gospel, all helping with hand and pocket. Mr. Ashworth went to Bagslate Chapel as a boy and received his first lessons about God at Bagslate Sunday School. The Sunday School was held in the body of the old Wesleyan Methodist Chapel. He had 2 very different teachers. One, called Old James, was patient with kind words and a loving heart, while the other, known as him with the stick, was stern and bad-tempered. At the Sunday school, the class would gather round a large, warm stove in the bottom of the chapel to eat their dinner. Mr. Ashworth remembered eating an apple cake his mother had made for him, which he said was more selvage than apple, but he says, as he knew it was the best she could afford, he ate it without a murmur. One evening, when John Ashworth was playing marbles with his friends, his mother asked him to come in and go to bed early so she could mend his ragged clothes. He silently walked upstairs to allow her to begin washing and patching, and crept naked into his humble bed, not to sleep, but to think and to weep. He later said, "My mind wandered far into the future that night. What air castles I did build. I thought I grew to be a man, entered into business, made money, built a new house with a white door and brass knocker to it, planted trees around it, and had a lawn and a garden, bought myself new clothes and 20 shirts, bought my mother a new bonnet, and gave her plenty of money to buy clothes for my brothers and sisters, then fell asleep a man of great importance, and awoke in the morning without a shirt." The next morning his mother had made him a new pinafore from an old wool sheet with the word wool stamped on it in big black letters. When he saw it, John Ashworth's little spirit sank within him. He said, "I looked into my mother's face, but when I saw the tears in her eyes, I instantly said, 'Never mind, mother, never mind. It will do very well. It covers my patches, and when I get to school I will sit on the letters and then no one will see them. Don't cry, mother. We shall be better off yet.'" He went off to the Sunday school with bare feet and wearing the packed sheet pinafore. When he got there, he put his bare feet under the form to prevent his proud classmates from treading on his toes, and was sad thinking he had left his mother in tears, but when he saw her come to the service and he saw her look down at him from the gallery and smile, all was right again. He said, "I could smile in return and join in singing God's praises, and hope for better days." Another scholar with John Ashworth at Bagslate Chapel was a boy called Edmund. One day Mr. Ashworth said he and Edmund made a pact with the other boys that they would always go to the Sunday school and keep the Sabbath day holy, but Edmund didn't keep to the pact. About a year later, when John was on his way home from the school, he saw Edmund with some other boys. Whilst sat on the top of a hedge, he mocked John, shouting, "Amen, amen, let us pray." In later years, Edmund's life took a downwards turn. He requested John Ashworth visit him and pray with him at a lodging house when he was ill from drinking too much. Mr. Ashworth even ended up being on jury service, and as foreman was given the task of announcing a guilty verdict at Edmund's trial in Manchester after he was involved in stealing a sack of malt. Mr. Ashworth later said he had a heavy heart and very nearly broke down when he did so, and Edmund was sentenced to 6 weeks' imprisonment with hard labour. The two former school friends' paths crossed again when Edmund was dying, and he asked for Mr. Ashworth to visit him again. Mr. Ashworth encouraged Edmund by reading passages of the New Testament to him and reminded him of God's mercy towards sinners, and Edmund died shortly afterwards. There was a man called James Nuttall who lived in the locality when John Ashworth was younger. James Nuttall was known as Gemma Nutter and was a good old man who, for many years, spent the whole of his time visiting the poor, the sick and the dying. 3 women once carried out a wicked scheme, fooling Mr. Nuttall by pretending one of them was poorly. When he came to pray with her, they used a shilling he gave them to buy some beef tea to get themselves some rum instead. On another occasion, Mr. Nuttall went to visit a sick dressmaker who was confined to her bed. When he knelt down and prayed for God to pardon all the woman's sins, she lifted up his walking stick, intending to bring it down on his head for daring to call her a sinner. In his mercy, God stopped her, saving Mr. Nuttall's life and saving the woman from becoming a murderer. The sick woman recovered, apparently recognised she was indeed a sinner, and later became a member at Hope Chapel. When he left Bagslate Sunday School, John Ashworth went to Bamford Sunday School at Bamford Chapel. It was in the school here at a certain Whit Friday school festival that he sat, a poor barefooted boy, and stood on the platform to receive first prize from one of the superintendents, Sir James K. Shuttleworth, wearing his old wool-sack pinafore. The evening before he was to receive his prize, he asked his mother if she could buy him a second-hand pair of clogs. She was sad because she couldn't afford to, so he ran 2 miles to the house of a relative to ask if he could lend him the money. When he got there, he knocked at the door, warming his feet with his hands as he waited for someone to answer. But when the man came to the door, he refused to lend John Ashworth any money, saying, "Never mind your feet, toes were made before clogs." At the chapel the following day, John Ashworth was invited onto the platform amidst a loud clapping of hands. He said, "I felt at that moment as though I would have given £20 if I had possessed it for something with which to cover my feet. I arose from my corner and, threading my way through the people as softly as though I were a cat, I walked blushingly onto the platform and received my reward amidst the repeated clapping of the audience. But when I got back to my place, I sat down and cried as though my heart would break, because I was such a poor, poor boy, and because I thought some of the other boys sneered at my poverty." One morning when John Ashworth got up, he said, "I was not aware that anyone in the house had risen before me, and was softly creeping downstairs, fearing to disturb any of the family, when I heard a low voice. I sat down on the steps to listen. It was my mother's voice, and she was praying for all her children by name. I leaned forward and held my breath lest I should miss one word. I heard her say, 'Lord bless John, keep him from bad company and make him a good and useful man.'" He later said, "Her words went to my young heart, and they are ringing in my ears to this hour. Lord bless John." He said, "That short prayer uttered by my mother when she thought no one heard her but God has been to me a precious legacy." John Ashworth said he loved the Sunday school, and said there, like many poor children, he got most of his education, but for a few months he also went to a free school in Red Cross Street in Rochdale. This was where the Brickcroft Social Club is now. In 1821 he was given a new shilling and a medal on the day George IV was crowned, and said, "We were ordered to hang the medals on our buttons and attend St. Mary's Chapel on the following Sunday." There was a boy called James who lived near John Ashworth and was in the same class at the school. In October 1821, James's father George committed a violent robbery with two other men called John Taylor and Thomas Lang at Hopwood Hall in Middleton, a crime which at that time in history was punishable with death. Before being charged and sent heavily ironed to be hanged at Lancaster Castle, George was put in a prison on Rope Street in Rochdale. In those days, offenders against the law were confined in the jail or prison, which was known as the Rochdale Lock-up. While George was in the prison, his son James asked John Ashworth to go with him to find out if he could see his father. He wasn't allowed, but managed to speak to him through the lock-hole. On the day they found out George was to be executed, John Ashworth said poor James, his son, could not eat his dinner, but gave it away to the other boys in the school. The day James and his mother found out James's father George was to be executed for the robbery, James's distraught mother collected James and John Ashworth from the school and walked them home through the fields to avoid seeing people on the highway. They sat on top of a brow just behind a farmhouse at Pitt's, where they all wept till it was dark. James's mother then took the two boys by the hands and said, "My dear boys, never be idle, never steal. Pray to God to make you honest and good." George was taken to Lancaster Castle and executed there on the 20th of April 1822. James's mother travelled on foot to the execution and after the hanging got a coffin ready and hired a cart to carry her husband's remains back to Rochdale. She returned walking the long journey back alone behind the cart, only agreeing to be lifted into the cart alongside the coffin when her strength failed her. John Ashworth acquired a taste for reading from a very early age. A young friend lent him 3 little halfpenny books, one called Babes in the Wood, one about Cock Robin and one about Jenny Wren. He said, "What influence these 3 deeply interesting narratives had in giving me a love for reading or creating a desire for other books, I cannot tell, but I do know that I had an intense wish to have a library of my own. But circumstances were greatly against me, so I was content and glad to borrow where I could and when I could." There was a man called Westall who kept a second-hand bookstall in Rochdale Market. Westall was a stout, red-faced man who wore a broad-brimmed hat. When he was a boy, John Ashworth couldn't afford to buy books, but Westall was very kind and allowed him to stand and read books at one end of his stall where he was out of the way of his richer customers. Mr. Ashworth said reading filled him with such deep enjoyment and delight that he frequently forgot time or weather. Many times when the hour came for moving off, he'd lost the use of his feet or felt as if he was without toes. He would also stand for hours at home in his bare feet reading to the other members of the family out of Fox's Book of Martyrs and Tales of the Covenanters, till they were all in tears. Apparently Mr. Ashworth's power of storytelling was remarkable, and it produced the most powerful impressions upon his boyish companions. There was a respectable old weaver named J. Midgley who lived at the top of Yorkshire Street in Rochdale. Midgley was 60 years old, but he'd never been many yards from home before. A few friends induced him to accompany them to a neighbouring mount called Brown Wardle. On reaching the top of the hill, Midgley looked round with amazement, exclaiming, "I didn't think England had been so big." Mr. Ashworth said he felt similar to Midgley in that after reading a particular book of geography as a child, it greatly expanded his own view of the world. As a young man, John Ashworth was in the habit of going to Providence Chapel, which was located on High Street in Rochdale. The chapel no longer exists. More recently there was a Salvation Army hostel named Providence House on the same site, but that has also since been demolished. There was a little pew inside that was so small it would not hold more than one. Mr. Ashworth said, "Whether they collected any rent for that pew I do not know. I never paid anything for it. I had nothing to pay with." It was here one Sunday that the minister, Mr. Ely, made use in his sermon of the word prerogative. The word was new to John Ashworth, so he approached a travelling bookseller who agreed to sell him a Johnson's Dictionary for 2 shillings and 6pence, paying for it in instalments of 2p a month. To raise the money to pay for it, he swept up some coal for an old man called James. He'd hoped to get a penny for doing so, but instead the old man just chased him away, saying, "I will coals thee if thou comes here again." John Ashworth was mortified and said, "I felt as if I would have scattered his coals all over Lancashire if I could." A local woman called Lucy needed someone to take her husband Jack his dinner sometimes, so John Ashworth offered to do so if she paid him. She agreed to give him a halfpenny every 3 times he went. Mr. Ashworth said 3 times there and 3 times back was 6 miles. 4 times 6 are 24 miles for my first tuppence to buy the first instalment for my first book. Mr. Ashworth purchased his dictionary and from then on made a bargain with himself that he would never pass a word he did not understand without consulting that book. When he was about 10 years old, John Ashworth and his family moved a few hundred yards nearer Rochdale from his birthplace at Cuckgate to a row of houses called Catches, near where Cuckgate Baptist Church is now situated. Although the row of houses are no longer here, the track alongside the church is still called the Catches. At Catches, Mr. Ashworth began to learn his father's trade, that of weaving, in the room over the house. When he was about 12 years of age, John Ashworth heard a man called William Dawson preach. He said it was while the sermon was being delivered that he particularly felt that he had some work to do for God. Somewhere near Cut Lane in Cuckgate, just off Caldershaw Road, there was a farm called Cut Lane Farm. When he first met her, John Ashworth's first wife, Jane Thornber, lived here with her parents. At some point between the ages of 10 and 16, when he lived at Catches, John Ashworth fell in love with Jane, the only daughter of William and Jane Thornber. William Thornber was a respectable, godly farmer who was also a rather popular local preacher. It was on the day they moved to Cut Lane Farm that John Ashworth first saw Jane. He said, "It was a fine summer evening. When returning from my day's work, I met a tall young woman with a small basket in one hand and a little flower pot containing a geranium in the other. I had never seen her before, and the moment we met I stood still, intending to speak to her, but could not. She blushed and passed on, and not one word was spoken." He went home to change his coat and hat and decided he would follow her even if she went to Jerusalem, but his sister told him the new farmer's daughter had just gone past with a beautiful flower in her hand, and his fears were calmed. He walked past the house several times, and although he didn't see her, he saw the flower pot in the window and knew she must have put it there. Many eyes were fixed on Jane and her family when they came into the chapel on the Sunday morning, but none with so deep an interest as John Ashworth's. He said, "How beautiful! How neatly attired! I had never seen so nice a bonnet. It was a real bonnet, not a patch stuck on the top of the head as bonnets are now, but a modest, sensible bonnet, a bonnet I well remember to this day." When he was about 16 years old, John Ashworth moved with his parents to the neighbourhood of Simpson Clough near Bamford, residing part of a year at a place called Top of the Wood, occupying the middle one of 3 brick houses near the Bird in Hand. The Ashworth family moved down to Simpson Clough in about 1830. Simpson Clough is situated on the old road between Bury and Rochdale. The house occupied by the family was on the margin of a deep ravine, very much frequented by visitors going to and from Ashworth Wood. The country around was beautiful and picturesque, and was a great source of inspiration for someone with a youthful, energetic and poetic mind like John Ashworth. In the front of the house is a plantation sloping down to the River Roach, which flows past its base. At the back is Ashworth Wood, one of the most romantic spots in the neighbourhood, where John Ashworth spent many hours and where he composed much of his early poetry. His admiration of God's works and the beauty of nature was undoubtedly acquired by the scenery around Simpson Clough. John Ashworth's father often got excessively drunk, which was the cause of a lot of suffering for the Ashworth family. One dark night of sorrow in the woods, young John, known as Johnny, prayed for his father that he might not get drunk any more.